What are you doing today? Hopefully we're not death by PowerPoint by now. Right? Anyway. So as Bill said, my name is Brenda Mahan. I'm an occupational therapist by background. I have been working in the long-term care setting for about 25 years. I now work as the clinical education manager for Broda. And I am passionate about seating and positioning. It's really important in long-term care. I actually was a director of rehab for the last 10 years. Is there anybody in the room that's not an administrator? One. Okay. What's your background? Oh, okay, great. So this is the largest room of administrators I've ever been in front of. So I'm really excited about that. So, and I really commend you for being in here because seating and positioning, it's really important for you guys to understand why therapists ask for the equipment that they do. So hopefully you'll get a little bit of a background today, because I know when they come at you with different cushions and wheelchairs, you don't understand why, you know, a basic wheelchair won't do the trick. So hopefully we'll give you a little more insight into that today. We do have a virtual audience at home too. So if anybody does have any questions during the presentation, I'm just going to repeat them for the people that are at home. You don't need me to read that. I'm sure we can all read. Okay. So the idea today is I want you to understand the basic aspects of seating and positioning, the importance of achieving proper fit between the seating system. It's not just a wheelchair. It should actually be a system. That includes the cushion, the back, whatever the chair comes with. The factors of selecting an appropriate seating surface. So these are all things that go through your therapist and ATP's minds, and how to apply the seating and positioning techniques to get optimal postural alignment and to support and promote function. Because at the end of the day, that's what's so important about seating and positioning, is the ability to support function. So why is it important? We're going to talk about that a bit. Sorry, I had a little something up here for myself just to remind myself in case I needed it. Little slide up here. Okay, so it used to be the old adage, and the thing that I used to hear a lot about from people in long-term care, because I've been in a few facilities. I've worked in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and lastly in Florida. I live in Florida now. I didn't move to all those states. I lived in the tri-state area, so it would depend on which company I was working for and where I would travel. That was what I was trying to avoid, my clock going off. But anyway, it used to be the old thing I used to hear a lot of is the nursing home just really has to supply a basic wheelchair for someone. So I'm going to challenge you to think about that today, because truth be told, I'm sure we're all familiar with the Impact Act, right? So the Impact Act covers those 5 quality indicators. And I'm going to let you know now that 3 of them are definitely related to seating. It's going to be your function, right? It's going to be skin integrity, and it's going to be falls. So all 3 of those tie into proper seating and positioning. So this study was 2020 here. So it was done in 2017, 20,300 deaths during that time frame from pressure injuries worldwide. And I bet since COVID, that's gone up exponentially. I don't know what it's like in Kansas because I've never been here before, but out of those states that I mentioned, I did work in Florida in 2 skilled facilities during COVID. And I can tell you my experience during in those COVID units. Now, most of the patients that we had already had the people that were on the COVID unit definitely had some type of mobility impairment. They usually had some kind of cognitive impairment. And what did we do? We kept them behind locked doors, right, with their cognitive impairment. We had staffing shortages through COVID, especially during the heights of COVID. So I'm sure there was a lot of unwitnessed falls. So I can't even imagine what the fall data will come out. That should be coming out soon about falls. And this says 1 in 10 in a nursing home residents have a pressure injury, and stage 2 is the most prevalent. So again, going back to that Impact Act, right? If someone comes to the facility and already has a pressure injury, we're supposed to minimize it, right? We're supposed to have it heal. We're not supposed to let it get worse. Again, that relates back to seating and positioning. If they don't have an injury, we want to prevent one. One size doesn't fit all. So your standard 18 by 16 wheelchair does not fit everyone, no matter what you were told. They don't work for everybody. It's a skilled service. So I'm a big proponent of teaching therapists how to fish. And I'm going to make this offer to anybody in the room right now. My job is education. That's what I do for Broda. I am willing, if your facility is struggling with seating and positioning and falls, please contact me. You can get a business card at the booth, or you can get one from me today, well, after the presentation. Please contact me. I'd be happy to do CEUs for your facility via webinar, okay? Anytime. That's free. Be happy to do that for you. Because I think if we teach, a lot of times therapists don't learn a lot about seating and positioning in school. Some of you are really lucky. You have some experts in your building, and that's great. But that is not usually the majority. And that's not what I've come across throughout my career. And the reason being, a lot of them shy away from it because we don't get taught a lot about it in school. So if anybody wants, I have 5 continuing education credits I'd be happy to do for any of your facilities. So that's a standing offer. I just want to put that out there. Proper fit is really the most important thing that we can do for our patients. So this is what we used to learn in school, 90, 90, 90. I hope they're not still teaching that in school. Nobody's body is built that way. Are any of you sitting that way right now? Right? That's not a natural position for most of us. And if you're like me and posture was always an issue my whole life, I definitely am not going to sit 90-90. So why is that important? If we take somebody and we put them in that basic sling seat wheelchair that we get from our vendor, where we get from our catalogs, that system is set up 90-90. It's not a good, you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole for most of our patients that have lived a life, right? Because we all have injuries, comorbidities are a lot higher in skilled facilities. So these are all things to think about. And we'll talk more about sling seating in a little while. Your therapist should be screening for positioning all the time. And you're going to know how good they are with seating and positioning after we talk about abnormal postures. And those are the people that should definitely contact me after. If you have a lot of patients sitting really poorly in your facility, then your rehab team needs help. Your rehab team needs help, and you need some better equipment choices. Think about that for capital budget for next year, because that's really important. They should be looking at anybody after a fall, anybody that's getting readmitted. We're detectives in the facility, right? Anytime somebody falls, a lot of times they're unwitnessed, right? How many falls are witnessed? Not that many. A lot of them are unwitnessed. So as therapists, nurses, administrators, whoever we are, we're always like detectives. We got to try to figure out, well, it was about this time of day. Mrs. Jones, everybody's Jones and Smith. Mrs. Jones usually has to toilet around now. So she was probably trying to get to the toilet. So we usually have a pretty good idea what might have been going on and why they fell. But these are all reasons people should look at seating and positioning. Not to mention, we don't do that in a silo, right? We don't just look at somebody for seating and positioning. Hopefully every time your therapists are doing an evaluation for anybody, they're looking at everything, right? They're taking a look at everything, because everything affects seating and positioning. Everything affects everything else going on with someone. When you go to the mechanic, if you're just getting an oil change, maybe they're just going to do an oil change. But if you go in and bring it for something else, while they have the hood open, they're looking at other things. At least we hope so, right? Same thing with your therapist. So here's another important thing that I preach all the time. Your therapist should absolutely be getting, if they're doing seating and positioning, they should be getting everybody on the plinth or the mat in your facility, right? Everybody have a mat or a plinth in their rehab rooms? Nobody? Come on, you guys have high-low mats and stuff, right? Anyway, the point is, when they're doing a seating evaluation, they should not be doing it in the wheelchair, because that's not going to show them anything. They need to get them out of the wheelchair, get them on the mat so that they can sit. Do they need to be supported? Do they need their hands? Like, these are all important things we need to know. We need to know what their body looks like, and we can't tell that when they're sitting in a chair, especially if they're sitting in a sling seat wheelchair. So hopefully they're getting everybody on the mat. So for the longest time, just a little fun fact, I went around talking about this. It's like, here's my cute little dragon slide. It's not a dragon, right? It's a griffin. So finally, someone shouted that out to me this year. I was like, okay, thanks. So there's my little griffin slide. Anyway, so we're going to talk about some of the abnormal postures. And the first one being an anterior pelvic tilt. This isn't as common. And a lot of times you see this with patients that have obesity or patients that have, especially like the apple-shaped body. They have that sway back presentation typically, like you see in that blurry skeleton that I have up there. Usually poor abdominal strength for a lot of these abnormal postures. Poor core strength is one of them. Tight hamstrings contribute to a lot of different postures, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to tell you that one of the go-tos that used to work really well for the anterior pelvic tilt, you're all going to go, ooh, it was a seat belt. Positioning belt, a positioning belt, not a seat belt. So I'm going to encourage you, if you do, to think a little outside the box. If you do have a therapist come to you one day and go, because for some people, that's the only thing they need, and that'll keep them in the chair. So if somebody really, we're definitely not trying to prevent rising, but if somebody could really benefit from a little bit, especially your people in your power wheelchairs for those facilities that allow them, that's just something to consider. Try to get out of that head of it being a restraint and think more about the positioning, especially if you're talking about a patient who is not mobile anyway, because a lot of times the patients that need the most help with positioning are not ambulatory. So just a little thing to put away, put in your back pocket. This is the bane of all therapist existence, the posterior pelvic tilt. You see that we recognize that posture, right? I don't know, me and my alarms. We recognize that posture, right? How many people do you see? You might not start out the day that way, but at the end of the day or after lunch, they start to wilt in their wheelchair, right? They start sliding down. A lot of times caused by poor abdominal strength and by tight hamstrings. Most men have tight hamstrings to begin with. When they get older, here's a hint, doesn't get better. So tight hamstrings definitely contribute. So the reason seating and positioning principles are so important for your therapist to learn is a lot of therapists don't understand that sometimes that's the culprit, and they do things that exacerbate the situation instead of help it. So just some things to remember. You can use cushions. There's some things you can do to help the posterior pelvic tilt for sure. One of the first things you need to do is not have somebody that sits with a posterior pelvic tilt in a sling seat wheelchair without at least some modifications. Also, what else happens during abnormal postures? It interferes with digestion. It affects breathing, right? Increased injury risk, increased transfer difficulty. We can go on and on. A lot of people with the posterior pelvic tilt are the ones that end up on the floor, right? Because they just keep sliding until they're at the edge of the floor. I hope no one in this room ever sees DICEM underneath a patient's bottom. There should never. It still happens. That's why I'm bringing it up. I still see it. There should never be DICEM underneath somebody between the person's bottom and the seating surface, ever. The only thing you should use DICEM for when it comes to seating and positioning is if you put it underneath the cushion and the seat. That's it. Reason being, I'll divert a little bit. There's something called, coefficient of friction. So most cushion covers, especially for your higher end cushion covers, and this is also why it's important to not put anything on top of cushions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the end of this, just to make it a short story, when you put DICEM underneath somebody, and there are people that'll swear that it works, they're not sliding anymore. They are sliding. Now their pelvis is sliding underneath their skin, and that's how you get shear injury. Now pressure injuries, they usually take a little time. We get some warning that they're going to occur, right? With shear, you get no warning. By the time it happens, it's already gone through all the skin layers. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You should never, ever see DICEM underneath somebody's bottom. Okay. I know no one's going to admit to it if they have recently. Pelvic obliquity, those are often caused by the causes right here, post-hip surgery. Usually one side's higher than the other. You could actually get a pelvic obliquity from sitting in poor posture in a sling seat wheelchair. We want to prevent that. There are things, I always say, I don't know when we became like Oprah in the long-term care industry, because again, I've been around for a minute. Everybody that comes to the facility gets a wheelchair, right? You get a wheelchair, you get a wheelchair, everybody gets a wheelchair. And that's okay. That's probably appropriate, right? Because they're coming to the facility for a reason. There's been some kind of decline. Either they came from the hospital, they were really sick, they came from home because they were having falls, whatever the case may be. They're coming to us for short-term rehab. There's a reason. And we want to keep them safe. We don't really know a lot about them yet, so we want to keep them safe. My challenge to you is, I don't know when it happened, but we stopped getting people out of wheelchairs, right? We put them in a wheelchair and we left them there all day. And some of our folks are sitting 8-10 hours a day. Let's get them up. Not everybody. I'm not talking about your patients that are a Hoyer lift, right? I'm not being ridiculous. We could position them and we could do other things to relieve pressure. But I'm talking about your other patients that were mid-mod assist. Do you know how many falls and wounds you could prevent if you get folks out of chairs a couple times a day? What happened to getting them out of the wheelchair and sitting them at the dining room table, right? So that they could feel more like a person again. They're not always sitting in wheelchair prison, especially if they're sitting in a basic wheelchair. We need to get them up. And I encourage you to, when your therapists are looking to discharge people, especially your long-term care residents or the ones that are going to stay for long-term care, challenge them. Hey, can we do walk to dine? I don't know. What happened to those programs? We used to be really good at that stuff. It hasn't gotten any better since COVID. So my approach has always been, for my patients all my life, students that I've had, is small changes over time. So I'm giving you all these little pearls, and there's little things we can do over time. Just challenge them to think about it. Just challenge them to get their residents out of their wheelchair once a day into a dining room chair. Or your patients that can walk short distances, can we walk them to at least one meal a day? Right? A lot of you are getting paid for restorative programs. Let's rework these restorative programs and get them to work so that we keep our patients from falling and declining. There's some things that happen with pelvic obliquities. I think you guys all get a copy of this if you want it. You can always get it from me too. Windswept deformity. I'm sure we've all seen one of those postures in our careers, right? Those are really tough. It's really tough to position somebody. It is almost impossible to position somebody in a standard wheelchair with a windswept deformity. They're definitely going to get a contracture or a wound. So something to consider here. And one of the biggest mistakes, I'm going to put this out there too. Here's another pearl for you. We overuse elevating leg supports to death. Most people should have regular footrests on their chair. Most people. Just another thing to put on there. A lot of times people will put elevating leg rests on somebody with a windswept deformity. You're going to cause problems. It's going to exacerbate the posture. I can't tell you how many times during my career that I have been called to evaluate somebody for feeding difficulty, right? Because I'm an OT, so they're having trouble feeding themselves. And then I go in to take a look at them, and guess how they're sitting? There's really no mystery there, right? Before we could do anything else, we got to get them sitting upright. And how fatigued are you if you're sitting like this and you're trying to feed yourself? That's a lot of work, right? So I've gotten a lot of, you know who usually catches this, or the speech therapists. The speech therapists will get called for a swallowing difficulty. And a lot of times it's really not a swallowing problem, it's a posture problem. So just another thing to think about. There's how many deaths occur. That statistic is from 2008. I'm sure it's a lot worse now. And do you want to sit there? That's an actual picture of a wheelchair in a facility that I used to work at not too long ago. So those chairs are still out there. That chair is so old that it has fixed armrest and fixed foot supports. So that's been around a minute. You see how slung that was? I don't know if anybody's going to admit this. How many people have Jerry chairs in their facility? Liars. You're all fibbing. I'll tell you what a jerry chair is, because if you don't know me, you don't know this. Not a big fan of the jerry chair, never have been, never will be. They're really just an uncomfortable, unsupportive piece of furniture. They're awful. They do nothing for positioning. A few years ago, and hopefully there's not a lot of this going on anymore, you used to walk into a day room in a long-term care facility and everybody was in a jerry chair. Not everybody, everybody with cognitive impairments was in a jerry chair. A lot of our Alzheimer's or patients with dementia were in a jerry chair, reclined, looking up at the ceiling. Anybody been around long enough to have seen that? Because hopefully it's not going on anymore. Yeah, awful, right? So anywhere I used to go, especially when I was a director, I was really known for picking up Med B caseload. You know why? Seating and positioning. Because again, like I said, a lot of therapists aren't really comfortable with it. So I'd walk in a facility, and that's just an occupational hazard of mine. Anywhere I see people sitting in a wheelchair, I'm always evaluating their posture right away and how they're sitting in a chair. So my first order of business, well, this is how long I've been around, was to get rid of the posy belts. That was the first order of business. And then as I'd been around for a while and we finally got rid of posy belts, I think 2000 and, oh gosh, let me see. I want to say 2006, I actually worked in a place in Pennsylvania that still had posies on wheelchairs. So guess what? People used to fall with the chair on top of them because what are we doing there? We're virtually taking somebody and tying them to a chair. So hopefully we're not restraining anybody anymore. I know we're really not using alarms as much anymore. Those are all considered restraints. So thank goodness for that. But jerry chairs, what they used to do where I worked is put those big high wedge cushions inside the jerry chair. First of all, if you ever see one of those big high wedge cushions, we're definitely doing the wrong thing. We need to start over. That should never, those are never the answer. And if we're putting them in a jerry chair, what happens? They used to climb out over the side, right? Because the sides are so small on those, everybody go off over the side. And besides, they're like pushing a U-boat, right? Have you ever tried to move one? So my big story with jerry chairs was, that was one of the first things I would do when I'd go into a long-term care facility, was get rid of all the jerry chairs. And in fairness, I would bring the patients in to the therapy room. I would assess them in something different, usually like a tilt and recline. And I would leave them in the facility. I would actually start seeing other patients, not billing them anymore, so don't get upset. I would start seeing other patients because I never thought it was a responsible thing for a therapist to do, stick them in front of the nurse's station to see, oh, let's see how they do in this chair. So I would keep them in the gym. I would keep them in with me for a while and take a look and make sure after 45 minutes, they didn't start sliding out of that posture and maybe it's not the chair for them. And what I started noticing over time, I can't tell you how many times I would find out, like Mrs. Jones or Mr. Smith would be really funny. And I'd go back to take them to the nurse's station and say, hey, tell the CNA, whoever was up there, and go, I can't believe how funny Mrs. Jones is. And they'd look at me like I had 3 heads. What do you mean? She doesn't talk? Probably because she's looking at the ceiling all day. So again, that's why part of this, the whole big theme here is to get them more functional and engaged. And we have to get out of that old mindset of keeping people reclined all day. And it's not going on like it used to be, but it still happens. I still see it because I still go into facilities, so I still see it, which is why I'm mentioning it. So jerry chairs and recline chairs. So you probably have some high back recliners in your facility, right? Those are probably your premier chairs. They're just a sling seat wheelchair with a higher back. That's all they are. And I did use those for some patients, maybe somebody's status post hip, right? Or a taller gentleman, because you never want a little petite lady in a reclining wheelchair with that being their headrest. That's never a good functional, that'll never work. But the problem with recline does actually offer good pressure relief, but used alone, recline is a high shear risk. And we do not want shear because shear is the enemy. So there's a place for it, just saying. Tilt can make all the difference for a lot of patients. It can help them take away the fatigue, just like recline. We used to use that idea for recline. It can assist with postural management. If you have a forward-facing tilt, they're still going to get that line of sight, right? If you have a seat to height floor low enough, you can get them to propel, still see what's in front of them, and keep them in good alignment. So that's something to consider. And it's really comfortable. No, just no. So we talked about components of a seating evaluation. I'll just go into it a little bit. So they should be looking at range of motion. They should be looking at vision. We should be looking at cognition. Cognition is always a little tricky sometimes. Sometimes people will slide under your radar. So if we're going to make the chair better for some people, we have to make sure that cognitively it's going to work for them as well, right? We definitely want to maximize comfort, independence, mobility. We want to get them more functional. We want to get them to have greater seating tolerance and be able to be involved and engaged in more things. Because let's face it, depression's at an all-time high too, and it kind of goes in hand with dementia, right? Sometimes depression can exacerbate dementia, right? Somebody with dementia looks a lot worse than they are because they're also depressed. We've all seen that during COVID, right? When people started getting isolated, their family members couldn't come in. Things changed, right? A lot of people shut down. The other important thing we want to do, and this is why a lot of times other disciplines, nurses, administrators, a lot of people don't understand why sometimes we can't just, can you just give Mr. Jones a cushion? You don't have to evaluate them. Just give them a different cushion. They're starting to get skin breakdown. It's kind of like Jenga, right? You can fix one thing on wheelchair seating and positioning. That's why we need to do an eval and keep somebody on for a little bit and take a look at how they're doing with everything. Maybe they do need a cushion. Well, guess what? Most basic wheelchairs come between 17.5, 19.5 inches seat to floor height, right? I don't know about your state, but in most of the states I've worked in, women outnumber men by a landslide in most skilled facilities. And how many little petite women you have that start to shrink as time goes by. And a lot of those standard wheelchairs, if they can propel with their feet, they're just getting by with their little foam cushion. And now they're starting to get breakdown. So we'll take this 3-inch pressure redistributing cushion and they're comfortable. And that's great. We can help them from getting skin breakdown, but now they can't touch the floor. And you can't get this. I mean, 3 inches is really high for someone who's just making heel strike before. So the other things that could cause secondary problems are a lot of wheelchairs are built today. It's all back here. You know, I can tell you that I keep thinking I need to be by the microphone. I can tell you that most people that I evaluate in long-term care, if I had to say, I'd say at least 50% of people when I do their range of motion have about this much range of motion. So if they have this much range of motion, how are they going to reach all the way behind themselves to propel, right? A lot of people, if they've lived a good life, have some osteoarthritis, right? Most of us in this room probably have some, most of it, maybe, I don't know, right? If you've lived a good life, you've had some injuries, you've done sports and been involved in activities, we have some injuries, right? So we don't want to cause a secondary injury. So that's another thing to think of. So if you have a wheelchair that has like 5 inches, this is what I want you to put in the back of your mind when you're thinking about capital budget and starting to replace some of your wheelchairs for next year. Look at things that have a lot of adjustability. That's always going to get you more bang for your buck, it'll fill multiple patients. So anytime you're looking at a chair and you're looking to buy some different wheelchairs, look at ones that have the armrests that are adjustable. Look at ones that have like 5 inches of seat to floor height adjustment. That'll give you a lot more, it'll give you a lot better inventory and you'll have a lot more tools for your therapist to work with. See how that wheel is front mounted? And now there's casters. So 2 things to talk about there. So the first one with the front mounted, that's going to solve that problem for your people that do have a lot of shoulder problems. So again, there's chairs made like that. So that's something you might want to consider getting a few of those. It's right here. Most people can do this, right? We know because they do this back here and they go like a half a mile an hour. So if it's in front of you, you definitely have a lot more zoom, right? Now, think about your patients with cognitive impairments and the ones that are really restless, that are really unsteady now. If they've never been in a wheelchair before, it's just like trying to give somebody who has a cognitive deficit a walker that's never used a walker before. It doesn't work, right? Unless it's a mild cognitive deficit, it doesn't work. They've never had one before. Their long-term memory isn't ingrained. They don't know how that works. But if you have 4 casters on some of these wheelchairs that are low seat to floor height, they know how to move their feet like they're walking, right? So for some patients, that might be your answer. Intervention considerations, other things we look at as therapists. What is the room set up like? Most nursing home rooms aren't very generous, right? They're not big. We usually have 2 to a room at least, right? I remember when there used to be 4 to a room. There are still some places that have that. So these are things we have to consider. Sometimes we have to split the difference. Sometimes somebody needs a 22-inch wheelchair. They're stuffed in an 18-inch wheelchair. That's not good. But we'll split the difference and put them in a 20 just so that it can get through the room. So there's a lot of things that therapists have to consider when it comes to seating and positioning. And let's face it, we have a lot of clutter going on in our facilities, right? That could be a whole other intervention. Dare I say hoarders, right? There's some situations out there, right? We always have a couple in every facility. So we're going to talk about cushions a little bit, just so you get a little bit of an understanding. I'm going to have a little water break. And seating surfaces. So there are some seating surfaces out there that you don't need cushions for. And that's something we could talk about later if anybody's interested. Here's another thing I'll say. You know, we used to buy a lot of those basic foam cushions to be our go-to, and that's what everybody gets along with their wheelchair, like Oprah. You get a foam cushion, you get a foam cushion. Again, challenge you, start replacing those with better cushions. And I think the reason we think they're such a good deal, like we can get a bulk of them so much cheaper, is because therapists tend to be hoarders because we're always afraid we're not going to get new equipment. So a lot of times we keep that stuff way past its expiration date, and you know what I'm talking about, right? The stains, the smell, they need to go in the garbage, right? The state doesn't want to see that for sure, right? Family members don't want to see that. So I challenge you to look at something better as your general use cushion that you're going to give to people that have good skin integrity. Challenge you to do that this year. Again, you have plenty of time for start setting for your capital for next year. We don't sell cushions, by the way, so I'm not trying to hawk any cushions out here. But it's just something to think about to save you money on. You're gonna have to invest in the front end, but it's gonna save you a lot on the back end. Pressure injuries, falls, wounds. There's pressure relieving cushions, there's positioning cushions, there's custom. We don't see too much custom anymore because once Medicaid stopped paying, Medicaid pays in a handful of states. Kansas, I don't believe, is one of them. Still pay for equipment in long-term care. That was beautiful when that used to happen. I used to be like Robin Hood. All the patients that had Medicaid got their custom chairs so I could take better equipment for the other patients. They used to call me the Grim Reaper because we'd have a lot of tilt and spaces in our facility. Well, I used to call them tilt and space. Now they just call them tilt and recline. We used to have a lot of them from Medicaid, and Mr. Jones would die. And then a couple of hours later, I'd be up outside the room. They're like, "Oh my God, you're horrible." I'm like, "Mrs. Smith needs it. She's been waiting. She really needs one of these chairs." So that was the nice thing about when we did still have some funding, we could take and rotate stock. And that's why it's important to have chairs that are like multi-use too. Seating properties you want to look for in a seating surface are immersion, envelopment, and offloading. Some cushions have all three. Some will have two, some will have one. So immersion is like when the body sinks into the cushion, right? Envelopment, it sinks in and it contours too. And then offloading is just offloading. That's like your little dip, your pelvic well that's in the back, right? And some cushions, like I said, have all three. Here, video worth 1,000 words. Put my little pelvis down there. There we go. Envelopment, and then you see the immersion because then it goes around it. And I just took the cushion cover off so that you could see that happen. Different materials accommodate the body in different ways. You know what's a great general use cushion, and unfortunately it's just not great for long-term care, is those honeycomb cushions, like those Equigel, just off the top of my head. There's a million different brands out there that make those polymer gel, basic use type cushions. Unfortunately, they are great for pressure relief, but unfortunately it's like the Princess and the Pea. A lot of people in long-term care don't like them because they're not kind of cushy, right? That's why they stick pillows. We'll give somebody a $500 cushion for a wound and they'll stick a pillow on top of it. That's always fun to see as a therapist. Again, those inexpensive cushions, why bother? That kind of cushion only belongs on Nana's seat for dinner. That's it. It does not belong in a wheelchair. Maybe if you have somebody, same thing with a sling seat, we go on and on. Maybe if you have somebody who can pressure relieve, maybe they can't walk because they have COPD or CHF, so they're limited in their mobility, but they can get up, they can still toilet, and they can do all those things. I could see it on that person, but not anybody else. This is a gel foam combo. I don't think that's a video. No. Oh, it is. Surprise. So again, I'm just trying to show you the different properties that come in the cushion. That one has a little abductor wedge in there, which is great for positioning. For someone who's not aggressively sliding in a chair, something like that could be enough for your posterior pelvic tilt. There's another gel foam. Again, it's got that little wedge. It does a little offloading. It takes the pressure off the sacrum, loads it on the trochanters. They can take it more. They can take the pressure. They're not that little tiny sacrum bone. And then they actually have, so here's what I'll say about making a standard wheelchair better for some people, right? You have to take the sling out of the seat. So you want to look for cushions like that have kind of a solid foam base, because that's going to take the sling out and position the pelvis, because your pelvis is the cornerstone of all positioning. When you see therapists throwing like pillows, that's another indicator that they need some positioning help. They're throwing pillows in the side of the chair like lateral supports. Positioning starts at the pelvis always, right? And then you work your way up. You have to see what's going on there first. But if you take the sling out of the seat, a lot of times that'll get rid of your problem. And they do make a lot of different types of cushions today that have that solid kind of foam base that you can use to take the sling out of the seat. This one actually has an obliquity kit. So instead of getting a custom cushion, there's things a therapist can do with that kit for different patients to adjust it. So I don't know if anyone's been around. J2 used to have one of those kits too. I used to play around with it all the time when I was a therapist until we started losing parts, because therapists are MacGyvers and we just start using stuff for other things. So you never know what's going to happen. So again, for some patients, these types of things can be a solution, right? Close up. Okay. There's that big wedge I was talking about before. No. If you see that, no. Just start over. That is never the answer, that high wedge. A little one, or those little saddle cushions are fine, but that one's not the answer. Air cushions, they're great for a lot of people. They make so many different brands today. I am going to tell you, if you use the old school type with the 4-inch cells that have the pump to inflate them, does anybody here know that those have to be fitted to the patient? Therapists don't know this either, by the way. If you don't learn this in school, or if you didn't go to a place, we don't know this, right? I just worked somewhere last year where the therapist was giving it to the tech, giving one of those 4-inch high air cells to give to a patient. I said, "Oh, did you fit her?" And she looked at me like I had 3 heads. That's no diss on her. The whole staff didn't know, so I did an in-service on how to properly fit that cushion to somebody. My point is, I would never use that cushion if that's what you have in the house. They're very expensive and they work really well for some patients. But if you're going to use that cushion, do what most VAs do. You know what the VA does? Because the VA swears by those 4-inch cell cushions. They love them. A lot of VAs that I've been into to do in-services at, they train everybody in the facility how to do that because therapists aren't there 24/7, right? And as a therapist, I'll give out that cushion to somebody. Once they're off program, do I see them again? You know when I see them again? When the CNA brings me the cushion that's totally flat and says, I don't know what happened. I don't know how long they've been sitting on that cushion. And just so you know, it's just as bad if it's overinflated. When somebody, they actually, how you can YouTube it if you want to see how they fit, but typically you put your hand underneath a gloved hand, say that for a reason, put a gloved hand underneath someone's bottom, right? And they sit on your hand. You should feel about an inch before it's going to bottom out by that pressure point, by their sacrum. And that's how you fit it for that patient. They have that one cushion that was in the middle is like a smart cushion that inflates itself. It's very expensive, but I'm sure for some spinal cord patients or for some patients that it's appropriate for, it's great. This is another type of air cushion. Some therapists swear by. It's just a little sample piece there. Oh, I didn't have a video for that one. It looks like little cream cheese packages inside. But you could take it out and make it more. I've never used one, so I can't tell you too much about it. There's that Dyson conversation. That's why it's important to use what came with the cushion. So you shouldn't switch and swap brands because especially your higher end cushions, they come with a specific coefficient of friction on that fabric to make that cushion work to its optimal. There should not be chucks pads on top. There should never be chucks pads on top of cushions. Again, no layer in between. You know, the Hoyer lifts still go under there. That's a fight for another day, but nothing should be in between those layers. It just takes away from the effectiveness. And then please tell me no one has a pummel cushion in their facility today. If you do, please go back and throw it out when you get there. The groin is not a weight-bearing surface. It's just back to like the Dyson thing again. People are still going to slide, but now they're going to slide. If you've ever seen a stage 3 or 4 on someone's genitals, you'll never use one of those again. It does not keep someone from sliding. They're still sliding in their skin. So that is never the answer. And the donuts, I have to say, usually the family members bring those in, right? Because a lot of our patients are old school. They swear by them. They think they work great. I don't even think they work good for their intended cause, but far be it for me to say. But pressure just builds around the border. So you're just taking it off one place and putting it somewhere else. So those are never good. Maybe just for hemorrhoids. That's it. Wounds and cushions, you have to know the etiology to know which type of cushion, what kind of seating surface you're going to use. And then I want to stress this because for many years I did it. I would get the best cushion and the best seating surface for someone and then neglect the back. Guess what? The back's still a sling. So we have to take the sling out of the back as well for it to be a whole seating system. So if you don't worry about if you don't do something about the back, you're just doing half the job. Again, for a lot of patients, a little bit of tilt will go a long way. They make a lot of different backs now today that'll even go on a standard wheelchair. They're not cheap, but these are things that you can mix and match in your facility that you can use so your therapists have better tools and you have better outcomes. You have better star ratings, right? There's some different backs, since I've been a therapist, I can't believe how many different types of cushions and backs there are out there today. And one of the most important principles about seating and positioning, I'll tell you, is especially for your patients that are high complexity, right? The more somebody that's max assist or that's a Hoyer lift, the more contact that they can make between the seating system and their body, the better pressure redistribution there is, the better comfort there is. We don't talk about comfort a lot, but it's a lot more comfortable if you're making good contact with the seating system that you're in. When someone's sitting in a posterior pelvic tilt, are they making good contact with their system? Their scapula and their sacrum is, and that's why they get breakdown. It's not redistributing the pressure. So if you think about that, if that's the only thing you remember today besides the pummels and a couple of other things, remember that the more contact you can make for higher complexity patients, better off that they are. So it has to kind of match their contours. And for everybody, it's different, right? We all have different bodies. Funding, I'm pretty sure in Kansas, we don't have any Medicaid state funding in Kansas, but I'm sure you have rental options, which that's another way to get some good equipment in your facilities. I'm sure you have rental options with some of your vendors. And then you can get chairs for people that, you know, we have a lot of people of size these days too, right? We don't want to stock a lot of 24, 26-inch wheelchairs, right? If the odds are they'll collect dust for a couple of years after that patient leaves the facility. So rental's always an option. If you have patients that come in that are on a Medicaid spend down, this is where we need to talk them out of getting the big screen TV and thinking about getting a decent wheelchair, right? Makes sense to me. And I've had patients that have wanted to do that for their loved ones, and that's really important. They're going to get a lot more use. Go get the TV at Walmart. You're going to get a lot more use out of a really good seating system. Restraints, I don't think we have to talk about. And the case study was really for therapists. So that was a lot. Anybody have any questions?
We have one question from online, and that is on the DISM topic. Should we not use it between the resident's bottom and the wheelchair, even if the resident has clothes on between themselves and the chair?
Absolutely not. Never, ever, ever, ever.
Yeah.
Because of sheer.
Other questions in the room for Brenda? Okay, let's thank Brenda for being with us this morning. Thank you, Breathe Oxygen, for sponsoring this education session.